Vamos lá. Bom dia a todos. Espero que todo mundo esteja bem aí e animado. A gente está muito feliz com o nosso evento, né? Está chegando ao fim já, hoje é o último dia, a gente tem só mais algumas atividades hoje, mas queria agradecer a presença de todos aqui e dizer que a gente está muito contente que vocês participaram do nosso evento e foi muito bom ter vocês com a gente aqui. Eu vou só dar alguns avisos antes da gente começar, então, a nossa palestra aqui com a Yaryna. Então, lembrando vocês, né, que a gente tem o Padlet e lá tem todas as informações importantes. Então, a gente já está chegando no final, mas esse Padlet ele vai continuar lá ativo por um tempo. E vocês vão poder consultar, pegar material das palestras, das atividades que nós tivemos, e poder continuar consultando e vendo, né, o mural de projetos de divulgação, ver os vídeos do 3 minutos e meio. Então, não percam essa oportunidade de explorar ao máximo, tirar todo o proveito desse evento, tirar tudo que vocês puderem, tá? E podem compartilhar os vídeos, né? Os vídeos de todas as atividades vão estar no nosso YouTube, no nosso canal do YouTube. Então, vocês podem compartilhar com as pessoas o que vocês acharam legal. Não deixem de compartilhar, tá bom? Então, agora, deixa eu só aceitar as pessoas aqui. Okay, so now I want to introduce you our speaker today. That's Yaryna Serkez, who kindly accepted our invitation to be here. So we are really glad to you. And Yaryna is Ukrainian, but now she works in US as a senior graphics editor in the New York Times. But now she's living in Germany. I just discovered today that she's living in Germany. And Yaryna holds a degree in journalism and a master in data journalism. So Yaryna have a lot to say to us today and a lot of experience. So many thanks again for your presence in our event. And to the participants, if you have any question at the end, you can turn on your mic, you can turn on your camera and ask, or if you want, you can just put in the chat and I can translate it to Yaryna or just read it, okay? So for everyone, have a nice talk.
Hi everyone. Okay, let me start with sharing my screen. One sec. Alrighty, here we go. Yeah, I hope you can see my screen now, right? Yes. Excellent. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Yaryna Serkez. I'm a senior graphics editor at the New York Times Opinion, where I write data-driven stories and create interactive data visualizations. And before we proceed, I just want to encourage, questions of all sorts. Please ask me questions. I'm happy to answer any of those. So yeah, working with sophisticated, multidimensional scientific data is a huge passion of mine. And that's actually a type of project that I enjoy the most. But obviously, communicating terabytes and gigabytes of data with just a few visuals is quite challenging at times. So today, I would like to share a bunch of approaches that I found particularly effective. One of them I call physical representation. So sometimes we work with the huge repositories of data that consist of dozens of folders with thousands of data files in them, and under the hood it's just a huge pile of numbers or data values otherwise. But then when we take a step back and we actually think about the data and what it represents, the meaning is very straightforward. That was the case with NASA's Cassini mission, almost 20 years long mission of Saturn exploration and its moons. And I was approached by my editor to actually tell a story of this few decades of space exploration in just a quick 5-minute read. which you might say, well, good luck with that, right? Because there were, gigabytes and terabytes of data, all sorts of data, navigation data, data from different kinds of sensors, photos, videos, audio data. And obviously navigating it all was quite complicated. But then I thought, well, what we are talking about here is actually a story of this tiny probe being launched from our planet and then spending years out there in the open space and exploring Saturn and its moons and kind of just learning new things about our universe. And I thought, why don't we tell this story? So I scraped a bunch of navigation data, and I built this 3D model of Saturn and its moons. And then I programmatically created those yellow lines, which I hope you see on the screen right now. Those are the trajectories of Cassini as it was exploring Saturn's system, and actually creating, recreating the path of the probe helped us to almost in a chronological way to kind of tell this story of a huge space exploration and everything that we've learned during those years. And having this 3D model actually helped us to, zoom in and out to different objects and kind of shed some light on the specifics and particular things that we've learned during this mission. So that combination of 3D modeling and interactive scrollytelling and overlap with videos and photos, as you see right now, was extremely effective in telling or communicating almost 20 years worth of scientific data. Before actually joining New York Times, I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and my another project, which was space related there, was a story of space businesses and entire industry of space businesses that was starting to develop at this point and obviously is growing right now. So I was approached by my editor with the task of telling a story of all types of space businesses that people are doing right now. And I was like, whoa, that sounds exciting and fascinating, but obviously a huge undertaking because the data is so versatile. But again, I thought, why not to build this actual representation of what's happening around our planet. So I built this 3D model, and then I've kind of created this 3D model of satellites across around our planet and different types of orbits, and then overlaying slightly more abstract types of data visualizations. We were able to shed some light on some nuances, like what types of companies or countries are participating in this space race, like what actually people are doing with those satellites, what are the type uses and use cases for them, and so on. Here's another project from a year ago, I believe. This one actually was created by a New York Times team to commemorate the tragical milestone of 100,000 COVID deaths. And as someone who works with data all the time, the very natural inclination would be to kind of code this data in some sort of abstract representation in dots, for instance, and then sort them by race or by gender or by age and tell different types of stories that are there in data, definitely. But again, this this type of abstraction would miss the whole human tragedy behind this, because after all, we are not talking just about statistics, we are talking about actual people and their lives and the loss of those. So I thought this even simplistic representation of people with tiny biographies and tiny personal stories was extremely effective in communicating and commemorating this, public trauma and tragedy that we've been through lately. Here's another project of mine, one of my the most recent ones. So I was lucky to work with an organization called American Forest, which been studying tree canopy distribution in major American cities. And the main takeaway from this study was that there's a huge discrepancy and inequality in tree coverage, with mostly rich and white communities having a very dense tree coverage, and those communities of color or disadvantaged communities being basically trapped in the so-called concrete jungle. So when I first got this data, it was obviously condensed to a bunch of line charts and bar charts. And you can look at them and you would read the same values, right? You would get the same message across. But then I thought, why don't we show the truth on the ground, right? The way it actually looks and those environments that different people live in. So we decided to first of all use actual satellite images. And then we added, this transition into sorted pixel values, which kind of represents bar charts. But again, this sole representation of actual environment was extremely powerful and striking. And the feedback I got from our readers was that this was like the most, compelling visuals in a way of communicating the problem. Another approach that one could take in explaining a really complicated data set is trying to find a good metaphor. Obviously, we as journalists enjoy this, courtesy of being able to play with words and metaphors a little bit more than a conventional, scientific community. But I believe to a certain extent, it could be used almost anywhere. So one project that I did almost a half a year ago was a project about climate risks and different types of them and how they affect populations across the globe. So the data I've got was extremely granular, and we were able to define what share of population across almost every 25 kilometers of planet Earth would be affected by different type of climate risk. But again, to tell a personal story of everyone on this planet is obviously impossible. But finding a good metaphor, and here we use dots as a representation of every 10,000 population, was a pretty good approach to both communicate, the sheer magnitude of this problem and the granularity of the data, because we were able to sort them, to color them by different types of risks, and eventually tell a richer story. Here is another project, this time done by Washington Post. This is again a project about this tragic milestone of 100,000 COVID deaths in the US. But here, the representation is a little bit more artistic, I would say. But I think in what it's trying to achieve, it's absolutely magnificent and effective in terms of conveying this, human tragedy, and emphasizing that we are not talking about, abstract dots or bar charts. We're talking about human lives and something that has a higher value. Simulation. This is another approach that we like to experiment in our work. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. Sometimes our data is quite sophisticated and implies different outcomes or different possibilities or different scenarios. So instead of boring our readers with 10 different displays and letting them navigate them, we tried to build a tool that would help them see how different variables impact the outcome. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, everyone was asking a question how long it would take to develop a vaccine, and the answer was quite different based on who you ask. So we cooperated with a bunch of scientists to build this model of vaccine development and what are the main phases that go into the process and how we can cut the time based on different scenarios, and we let our readers play with different outcomes. Another one was obviously actual COVID model, the spread of coronavirus. And at the very beginning, that was fairly, new concept, the whole curve concept and, social distancing norms, something that we had to learn, almost all of us. So we decided again to build this model so our readers could play with different variables and see how it could impact the spread of the virus across the entire population. Abstraction. I know I've already touched on abstraction, and I've mentioned that sometimes it might not be the most effective way of communicating information, but there are cases when it's actually probably the best way to go. So earlier this year, just right after first vaccine been approved, we've been collaborating with Sarga Foundation, an organization that that was actually studying all different types of barriers that could slow down the vaccination across the US. And they did this huge study of numerous reasons why certain places could be slower in vaccinating their populations. And they built this model of 5 major categories. And this was the data that we initially received. So you could see data per state in 5 different categories. And if you were from a particular state and you would wonder how your state is doing, you would have to kind of trace each map and then kind of carry that value in your head and try to compare it across 5 different variables, right? Which we thought, well, that certainly might work, but probably not the most effective way to kind of give a quick read to our readers. So I was playing with different types of, presenting this data, and eventually I ended up with this display where every state is represented with the so-called Roda chart. And then we have 5 axes and we have values across those 5 axes, and you could see which states are doing better and which states are expected to struggle with mass vaccination and why. And here is probably one of my favorite data visualizations ever. That's a project created by my colleagues at the New York Times a few years ago. That's a visualization of social mobility across different social economic groups. And again, here telling a story of every certain person is impossible and probably unnecessary to convey the gist of the study, because overall we are talking about general trend across the entire population. So what they did, they built this interactive simulation when you can see people growing in a certain social group, ending up in different stratas of income and the distribution as it progresses. which I felt at the time, and even now, a few years later, that was like a very smart and very elegant way of conveying this message and communicating this data. So overall, I would like to say complexity is great. We shouldn't try to avoid it. We just need to figure out a way to explain it and find a way to digest and process it and communicate in a way that would be the most straightforward and the most compelling to our readers. Thank you, and obrigado.
Okay, thanks, Yaryna. It was an amazing talk. So I encourage everyone to, if possible, turn on the mic to make your questions. So it's better to hear your voices than mine. But if you want to write in the chat, I can also read your questions. Okay, and wow, I wait people to make their questions, but I have one. I see that you have this approach of using, I see in your work that you like to use the spatial data, so to make maps and try to understand how the things are, I don't know, spatially concerning how is to, why did you went to this way of working with maps, and why you like this work, if you like, I don't know.
Well, really, the reason I actually started in this area in general was just at some point I realized that the data is basically everything. Like if you think about it, text is data, audio files is data, maps are data, numbers are obviously data. So like there are so many different things and stories you could tell if you just know how to use data and how to kind of communicate it across different mediums. So eventually, obviously, spatial data is something that you would come across quite often, because it's about geography, it's about our surroundings, it's about how we relate and our proximity to other groups of people, or other natural resources or what have you. And especially now when climate change is such a pressing topic, I believe we would see spatial analysis being more and more oftenly used in media and across the industry.
Great. So I have one question for you from Vinicius Suero. It's a colleague of you. So he says, you seem to be proficient in working with data, design, and code, correct? Please.
Well, so we think.
How would your work be different if you were collaborating with specialized professionals, one data scientist, one designer, one coder, for example?
Well, that's a good question. The way I've was kind of progressing in my career, I was trained as a universal soldier, so to say. So I had to work with data myself, and you have to have a good sense of design because you're building this complicated layout, and you know what's like what parts of it you should emphasize, what parts of it you should like pay special attention to, and eventually you have to know how to build it. But in general, in big teams like New York Times or Wall Street Journal or Washington Post, across the graphics team, you would have people who specialize on smaller fields, I would say. Like you would have someone who is extremely strong in cartography, for instance, or who is like extremely strong in statistics and data analysis, and you would have people who are better writers. So like we all collaborate together, and obviously you can't expect one person to know everything completely. So whenever I'm, I feel like there is someone on our team who has more experience working with this particular type of data or this particular type of statistical analysis, I would obviously reach out to them and seek their help or at least advice.
Mariela Castro is asking, how long does it take to develop those projects?
Daniela, that's a great question. It depends. It really depends on complexity of the project and news cycle. Again, like I work in the media, and my pace is completely different from, for instance, my husband's pace, who is a laser physicist and who is writing scientific papers, and he could do his experiment, conduct his experiment for a year or two, and he has this luxury of working on one project for at least a couple of months. Here we're talking more in terms of weeks, mostly. Obviously, more complicated projects could take a month or two, but we generally try to kind of stick to this time frame of starting from a week to 2 months, I would say.
Great. Victor Dubas is asking, what are the tools you use the most for making all those beautiful data visualizations?
Thanks, Victor, for your question. That's a complicated one because for different types of data viz, we are using different tools. But what I could recommend for sure is using D3GS library. That's a JavaScript library, which is kind of golden standard in the industry. It's extremely versatile and extremely flexible, and you could build anything from a map to a chart to custom database that only you can imagine. And for 3D models, I'm using 3GS JavaScript framework, which is a WebGL framework, which again is extremely powerful and extremely efficient in terms of performance, especially when we are trying to, put a extremely huge amount of data and animate it in our browser, and we are just hoping it won't chock and it would work on every tiny screen. That's probably a way to go.
And Yaryna, I want to, thanks. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I also want to ask one thing. We are facing like a very big problem with fake news and people, trying to explain false ideas or everything like that. How do you think that using graphics and explaining the information in a different way can help to overcome this problem of fake news and everything like that?
Well, that's a good question. Definitely a challenging one, but from the perspective of someone who works at Times, I can assure you that the process is extremely rigorous. And whenever you see a graphics or a chart or even a sentence written at Times, you would expect at least 3 to 5 people to double check it and cross check it and fact check it. And we obviously collaborate a lot with our fact checkers, and they're helping us to verify every single word that goes and is displayed on our graphics. So, we are trying to do our best. That's all we can do, really.
Yeah, people, do you have more questions to Yaryna? You have the chance. She's not always here with us, so I don't know if we have more questions. Okay. Vinicius is asking, how autonomous are you or your team regarding publication? I mean, how intense is the editing process?
That's a great question. Well, again, it would depend from project to project, but usually I would say I work with a few, so to say, algorithms. So there might be a project that I'm pitching, so the idea that is coming from me initially, or a project that one of our columnists brought up to us, and then we are collaborating. But essentially, what we are doing, we are trying to find a good, reliable data source, and then we are finding scientists behind this data source, and we are doing, you know, a very extensive interview just to make sure we understand the data, we know what the data is about, and we understand all the peculiarities of how the data was gathered and what it actually represents. And then after kind of doing this, you know, initial stage of research, I would take some time to kind of structure the narrative and the story to convey it and communicate it to our readers. And I would come up with the initial storyboard and like just initial sketches of like, here's what we are saying, here's our argument, here's how this chart will make us help us, you know, communicate this argument. So we have this initial storyboard, and then we are discussing it, and then we are, you know, polishing it, and we are adding and filling in the blanks. And I'm usually collaborating with field experts on writing the actual story. So we usually work together to kind of, you know, combine our strong sides. Not necessarily always, not all scientists are the best people to communicate their findings. So we are there to support them and help them to do this in the most effective way. And they're helping us to do it in the most correct and appropriate way, so to say.
Okay. So Mariella is asking you, I imagine that there are several approaches to communicate the same data. Which criteria do you use to pick a particular approach?
Oh yeah, Mariella, that's an excellent question. I would confess that almost every project of ours would have a bunch of sketches and a bunch of different forms that we've tried to communicate this data, and eventually the one that is the most effective and probably the most striking would win. Though I would also argue that it depends on like how it's actually a very interesting mix of, you know, capturing someone's attention and communicating it in the most effective way, and you know, emphasizing the most important takeaways. For instance, I had a project about social gaps in terms of education, income, and all sorts of, you know, social data between black population and white population in the US. And you would imagine this project, you could just do a bunch of bar charts, right? But bar charts is not what we are talking about. We are talking actually about gaps. So what we decided to do, we decided to kind of plot 2 points for every city where you would see the median value for white population and the median value for black population. And then this kind of negative space is the actual representation of gap, which was the most, you know, telling and the most straightforward way to kind of think about this huge discrepancy between those two populations.
Great. Juliana is asking you, telling about statistics, how do people usually access your work? Do you or your team share with you that data such as click on pieces or something like that to access the impact of it?
Oh, yeah, we obviously have a bunch of internal tracking tools. I mean, like we keep track of how many page views we have, and our team is doing some like our audience team is doing some analysis on how this project was perceived by our readers. And this is a good, complicated question in terms of balance, because sometimes it's not only about the story that would be the most clickable, it's about the story that would have the most impact or would be the most, so to say, important in terms of, societal change. Like, you could create a tool which is clickbaity and is extremely popular and everyone wants to click and see a result for themselves, like a personalized data-driven tool, but it's not necessarily the one that would change social inequality, for instance, or would change anything in climate change policies. So we strive for long-term impact, usually.
Okay. Talita is asking you, do you have a team of researchers to help you with some doubts during the structure of the narrative?
Yeah, to tell you that's an excellent question. So I would say we usually work with researchers. Whoever did the research, we would consult with them, and I would just bug them with multiple questions and emails and just like double checking everything that I understand right. So they would be except for being, our collaborators and co-authors, they're usually also our consultants in terms of data representation, in just making sure we got everything right. That's on a very early stage of the production. Later in the process, we have a team of fact checkers, which would go and check every single digit and every single word that is out there on the web page, and if there is even a slight doubt, we are double checking and triple checking all our calculations and everything.
So Juliana, she wrote some comments here on what you said. You do the best, but sometimes I imagine it doesn't work how you expected. She's talking about frustration, that sometimes she feels frustrated because communicating in every way can be frustrating sometimes. So how do you feel? Do you feel frustrated sometimes in your communication?
Well, that's a good question. Definitely like an existential thing I have to think through. Well, generally, I would say I'm in love with my work, and just like this sheer excitement of like digging through the data and figuring out how to express it and how to visualize it brings me a lot of joy. But yeah, obviously, it might be frustrating when, for instance, you're on a very tight deadline and you have this fantastic vision for this project, but eventually you have to publish something in 2 days from now, and there's just no room for further exploration. But we try to kind of find a workaround in cases like that. Maybe we would do a follow-up with like more in-depth analysis, but obviously, yes, in every profession there are ups and downs.
So Vinicius is asking you, how do you assess your work from a qualitative point of view, not just clicks, average time spent on page, or everything like that? Do you monitor social media response or conduct user interviews? If so, how does this qualitative research work?
Yeah, I would say so. We have an audience team which does exactly that. And we also have sort of this practice of tracing the impact of our stories, because sometimes, it could be a great story and it causes a huge public discussion, and like every second senator reposted your story, and you see Biden tweeting it, and like it's huge success and everyone is talking about it, but eventually there is no real life change, like no policies, no laws, no nothing. It was just a buzz for a couple of days and that's it, no matter how successful it was. But sometimes there are actual, real life changes. We had this, it was not actually my project. It was not really even a data project. It was a project about child pornography and the scandal around Pornhub, and it was a problem that was, very strongly communicated with our coworker who wrote an essay about it, and eventually Pornhub reacted, and there were a bunch of measures that have been taken to kind of prevent this happening in the future. So we obviously try to keep trace of real life impact that our stories sometimes have.
So I don't know if we have more questions, but I want to do one more. We have here a group that probably of all the group, one or two are designers. I believe that we have no journalists here. Probably the majority are biologists or students or chemistry maybe. So for us, what tips can you give on how to? You said that the complexity is important, so we just have to find a way to communicate this complexity. What tips can you give to us of how to do this? Maybe even graphically, because we usually have to use graphics in our work. So what tips do you have?
Yeah, well, that's hard to condense to just a few tips, I would say. But in general, the way we work, we usually try to think about if your user is to have just one takeaway from your work, what would it be? And just always think that, like, you as a professional, as a scientist, extremely like a wide range of things about this topic, and you could write a PhD, or you've already written one in a book or two on this. But if you are to communicate with the broader public, like, what is the most important thing from your research that you want people to know about? Like, what do you want them to remember? So start with that and make sure it's very strong and straightforwardly communicated. And then once they get this essential principle, you can layer up all the nuances and specifics of your research.
Talita asked about the apps names that you said. So I remember the D3JS, and there is one more. That's
3GS. Just a second. So here we go. That's for
it's 3GS.
Yeah.
One, okay.
Yeah. So D3GS is like a golden standard in this industry. And if you are a newcomer or you want to learn more, I highly encourage you to visit Observable Notebooks, because this is a huge community of people that are doing data viz, and they're publishing their code, and they're publishing their visuals, and they're explaining how they did that, and they're experimenting. For me personally, that was a great resource for learning, and still is. So I encourage you to try it too.
Great. I will, for the participants, I will post it in the Padlet so you don't forget. So if no one have any more questions, okay, I want to once more thank you very much, Yaryna, for all your time and for this great talk. And it was really good to have you here. So if you can someday come to Brazil and then visit us, okay?
Yeah,
so
thanks.
Many thanks, and thanks for all the participants, and see you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Obrigada. Have a great day. Bye-bye.